Chris had always believed in the strength of his marriage to Sarah, until the day he walked into their neighbor's house and discovered a secret that would shatter everything. In an instant, the life they had built together crumbled. Sarah, his wife, was in bed with Daniel, the man next door. What followed was a tragedy no one could have predicted, as betrayal turned into a violent, irreversible spiral. Chris, in a fit of uncontrollable rage and heartbreak, was about to make a choice that would change all their lives forever. In the small suburban town of Maplewood, life moved at a pace that was almost too perfect to be true. The streets were lined with tree-lined sidewalks, well-kept lawns, and homes that seemed like they had been plucked from a magazine cover. It was the type of place where families thrived, and everyone knew everyone else. In the middle of it all lived Chris and Sarah Marshall, a couple whose relationship appeared as flawless as the neighborhood itself. They were the quintessential pair. Their marriage seemed solid, their careers were on track, and they had 2 children, Emma and Lucas, who were both well-behaved and friendly. Chris, a lawyer, spent his days working hard at a local firm, and Sarah, a teacher, was involved in the community, always ready to lend a hand at school events or help out with a neighbor's children. The couple had built a life together from scratch, one that others often admired. They attended neighborhood block parties, invited friends over for barbecues, and always had a smile on their faces. To everyone who knew them, they were the embodiment of a happy, normal family. Nothing seemed out of place. Their neighbor, Daniel Thomas, had moved into the house next door about 6 months prior. He was in his early 30s, single, and had quickly become a fixture in the neighborhood. A soft-spoken man with a genuine smile, Daniel didn't seem to cause any trouble. He would often help Chris with odd jobs around the yard, or offer assistance when something needed fixing. He was friendly but maintained a level of mystery, never divulging too much about his past. For the most part, he kept to himself, though his occasional gatherings were always polite and quiet. No one had reason to suspect that the bond between him and Sarah was anything more than friendly neighborly interaction. Chris would often see Daniel in passing, chatting about sports or sharing a cold beer on the porch, never suspecting that something darker was unfolding just out of sight. The facade of this perfect neighborhood hid the secrets that could tear apart the lives of those who seemed the most content. Unbeknownst to Chris, Sarah and Daniel had been quietly developing a connection, one that would eventually break the trust between husband and wife. Their affair began as a secret, a small thing that they both convinced themselves would remain hidden, but like all secrets, it grew over time, unnoticed by the one person who mattered most. And so, life in Maplewood continued, blissfully unaware that beneath the surface, a storm was quietly brewing, ready to explode in a way that no one could have ever predicted. Chris Marshall had always been a dedicated husband, and his love for Sarah ran deep. They had built their lives together from the ground up, creating a partnership that to him felt unshakable. Their bond was the foundation of their existence, and every decision they made was meant to ensure the happiness of their family. With 2 young children, Emma and Lucas, life had always revolved around routine. Weekends were spent at the park, summer evenings were filled with family barbecues, and vacations were planned months in advance. Theirs was the kind of marriage that seemed invulnerable to the ordinary pressures of everyday life. Chris worked long hours as a lawyer, and while he was dedicated to his career, he always made sure to come home in time for dinner. His job was demanding, but it was a role he had carved out for himself with the hope of providing the best life possible for his family. Sarah, a teacher at the local elementary school, was just as committed to her work. Her students loved her, and she often brought home projects to work on late into the night. Both Chris and Sarah were driven individuals, but the sacrifices they made for their family never felt like burdens. They worked well together, managing the balance of their personal and professional lives with apparent ease. Despite their busy lives, Chris trusted Sarah completely. He never questioned her whereabouts or her actions. After all, why would he? They were partners in every sense of the word. The idea that something might be amiss never crossed his mind. Sarah, on the other hand, had a secret, a growing emotional distance from Chris that led her down a path she had never anticipated. She had found something with Daniel, her neighbor, that she hadn't realized she was missing. It started innocently, a conversation here, a smile there. But it didn't take long before they began spending more time together in private. For Sarah, the affair with Daniel wasn't driven by a lack of love for Chris, but rather an emotional void she had been feeling for some time. As much as she loved her husband, she began to feel disconnected, unnoticed in a life that had become consumed by routine and responsibility. Daniel, who was easy to talk to and understood her in ways Chris hadn't lately, filled that void. It wasn't meant to be anything serious at first, but as the weeks passed, the chemistry between them grew undeniable, and their secret meetings became more frequent. Chris had no idea. The thought that his wife was seeing someone else was unthinkable. In his mind, everything was as it should be. Their family was happy, their children were thriving, and their marriage was strong. But beneath the surface, Sarah's betrayal was slowly taking root, one small lie, and one stolen moment at a time. Neither she nor Daniel could foresee how their actions would eventually spiral out of control, and how the carefully constructed life they had all built would come crashing down when the truth inevitably came to light. It was a Thursday evening when Chris's usual routine was unexpectedly disrupted. After a long, taxing day at the law firm, he was eager to get home. His mind was cluttered with thoughts of paperwork and cases, but all he could focus on was the prospect of a quiet evening with Sarah and the kids. For weeks, he had felt the pressures of work weighing on him more than usual. He had promised himself that he would spend more time at home, trying to strike a balance between his career and family life. That evening, however, something felt different. Chris had been working late, longer than he had originally planned, and by the time he reached the parking lot outside his office, the sun had already begun to dip below the horizon. As he drove through the familiar streets of Maplewood, a sense of anticipation filled him. The house was supposed to be quiet, and he could already picture the family dinner that awaited him. He had spoken to Sarah earlier in the day, and she had mentioned that she was planning to make lasagna, one of his favorite meals. As he pulled into the driveway, he expected to see her car parked in the garage, but to his surprise, it wasn't there. At first, Chris thought nothing of it. Sarah might have taken the kids somewhere, or maybe she had gone out for a quick errand. He walked toward the front door, fumbled for his keys, and unlocked the door, calling out her name. There was no answer. The house was unusually quiet, and an unfamiliar tension gripped him as he stepped inside. It wasn't like Sarah to not respond, even if she was busy with something. He checked the kitchen, the living room, and even the back porch. She wasn't anywhere in sight. His mind began to race with possibilities. Maybe she was over at a neighbor's house, or perhaps they had gone out for a walk. That's when it crossed his mind. Daniel. Earlier in the morning, Sarah had mentioned that she had seen Daniel next door, working on his fence, and that she was planning to help him out with a few things later in the evening. Chris hadn't thought much of it at the time. Daniel was always around, offering a helping hand whenever someone needed it. But now, with Sarah's car absent, it seemed plausible that she had gone over to Daniel's house to lend him a hand with the repairs. Without any immediate cause for concern, Chris decided to check on them. He walked out the front door and made his way next door, a casual visit to make sure everything was fine. He thought he might catch Sarah and Daniel chatting or working together in the yard. But when he reached the door of Daniel's house, something didn't feel right. The lights were on, but there was no sound coming from inside. He hesitated for just a moment, then reached for the spare key to Daniel's house, which was hidden beneath a small rock near the door. Chris had used it before to check on Daniel when he'd gone away for the weekend, and it had become a sort of unspoken neighborly arrangement. As he opened the door and stepped inside, he called out softly for Sarah, thinking she might be in the living room. There was no answer. Moving through the dimly lit house, he walked toward the hallway, the silence growing thicker with each step. As he neared the bedroom, he thought he heard the sound of soft breathing. His heart began to race, but he couldn't put his finger on why. He thought nothing of it at first. Maybe Sarah was napping or resting in the room. But as he pushed the door open, the scene before him struck him like a punch to the gut. There, lying together in the bed, were Sarah and Daniel. The sight stopped him in his tracks. Chris stood frozen for what felt like an eternity, unable to fully process what his eyes were seeing. His wife, the woman he had trusted with his heart, was entwined in the arms of the man next door. The same man who had shared so many casual conversations with him over the months. The betrayal was raw and immediate, a wave of shock and anger crashing over him. The last thing Chris ever expected to find that night was the wreckage of his own marriage, laid bare before him in the most unexpected way. Chris stood motionless, his eyes fixed on the scene in front of him. His heart hammered in his chest, his breath caught in his throat, and for a moment, time seemed to freeze. The quiet of the room was suffocating, every second stretching out longer than it should have. The sight before him was like a cruel trick, a nightmare that he couldn't wake up from. There, in the dimly lit room, were his wife Sarah and their neighbor Daniel, lying together in a tangled mess of sheets. It was so intimate, so raw, and so painfully real. His mind couldn't quite comprehend it. Sarah, his Sarah, was in bed with Daniel, the man he had trusted, the man he had called a friend. Chris's first instinct was to yell, to scream, to shake them awake and demand answers, but nothing came out. His mouth was dry, his body frozen. His thoughts raced in a chaotic swirl of disbelief and disbelief alone. For a moment, it was as if the world around him had gone silent, and all he could hear was the pounding of his own heartbeat in his ears. The room felt too small, the air too thick. He felt as though he couldn't breathe, as though his very existence had suddenly unraveled in that one shocking moment. The betrayal felt like a physical weight pressing down on him, and he stumbled back, unable to tear his eyes away from the scene. His hands clenched into fists at his sides. How long had this been going on? How could Sarah, his wife, the woman he had shared everything with, do this to him? The questions spiraled in his mind, but no answers came. All he had was this moment, this gut-wrenching image that seemed to burn into his memory. His mind quickly jumped to the realization that they hadn't known he was there. They had no idea he had entered the house. The vulnerability in the scene. Before him, Sarah, caught in the arms of the man next door, completely unaware of his presence, only made the pain feel sharper. How had things come to this? Chris had always trusted Sarah completely, never once suspecting that anything could be amiss. The thought of her betraying him with Daniel, of the two of them sneaking around behind his back, was unimaginable. It wasn't just the act itself that hurt. It was the lies, the deception, the years of trust that had now crumbled in an instant. Chris had always believed their marriage was strong, unbreakable. They had built their life on that foundation. But now, with that foundation shattered, he was left with a cold, bitter truth that he couldn't ignore. Without fully thinking, he turned away from the bedroom door and stumbled out of the house. His feet moved on their own, carrying him out into the night air, but his mind remained fixed on what he had just seen. He walked through Daniel's yard, his mind clouded by anger and confusion. The streetlights blurred as he passed beneath them, the neighborhood suddenly feeling foreign, hostile. His hands were still clenched into fists, his entire body trembling with the adrenaline surging through him. What was he supposed to do now? How could he go back to the life he had once known, the life he thought he had? Sarah had shattered everything, with a single unforgivable act. There was no going back from this, no simple fix for what had been broken. Chris's world had just fallen apart in the most unexpected way, and as he stood there in the quiet of the night, he realized with a chilling certainty that his life would never be the same again. Chris walked aimlessly through the quiet streets, his mind a storm of thoughts he couldn't quite organize. The darkness of the evening matched the emptiness he felt inside. Each step he took seemed to echo the sudden, overwhelming realization that everything he had known was built on a lie. He had always believed in the sanctity of his marriage, in the bond he shared with Sarah, but now that foundation had crumbled. His breath came in shallow gasps as his thoughts bounced from one painful question to the next. How long had this been going on? Was it just one night? Or had Sarah and Daniel been carrying on behind his back for months? He didn't know what to do with himself. The anger inside him was consuming, building in a way he had never experienced before. He couldn't focus. His thoughts kept looping back to that horrifying moment. Sarah and Daniel, entwined together in a bed he had never imagined would be anything but a sanctuary of love and trust. The image replayed in his mind, each time more vivid, more painful. His fingers tightened into fists, and he had to force himself to unclench them. He felt sick. There were no words, no explanations that could erase what he had seen. No matter what Sarah said, or how she tried to justify it, nothing could undo the betrayal that had been laid bare before him. The trust he had placed in her was shattered, and he couldn't simply move past it. But what hurt more than the physical act of infidelity was the deception, the lies that had been told, the small, seemingly innocent moments when Sarah had hidden the truth from him. Those lies were what crushed him the most, more than anything else. Chris found himself standing at the edge of the park, the stillness of the night weighing down on him. His chest felt tight as he stared at the empty swings, the silence echoing in the air. His mind kept returning to Sarah. Was she even aware of how deeply she had hurt him? Could she even understand the damage her actions had caused? Was their marriage even salvageable? The thought of confronting her, of asking her to explain, made him feel like he was walking into an unknown perilous territory. What would he say? To her? What could he possibly say? He pulled his phone from his pocket and stared at it for a long moment. He thought about calling Sarah, but the thought of speaking to her after what he had witnessed felt impossible. What was there to say? Would she even try to deny it? Or would she admit the truth in a way that would only break him further? His thumb hovered over her name in his contacts list, but he couldn't bring himself to call. It was too raw, too much to process. Instead, he dialed Daniel's number, then quickly hung up. The idea of confronting Daniel directly felt wrong. He wasn't sure what he would even say to him. Part of him wanted to confront him, to demand answers, but another part of him felt strangely powerless. In that moment, Chris realized that no matter how much anger and pain consumed him, the truth was, he had no control over what had happened. He couldn't change it. The only thing he could do now was try to figure out how to survive in a world that no longer made sense. The dark sky above him seemed endless, and he felt small beneath it, his world shattered into pieces that he couldn't possibly put back together. He turned and began walking back toward home, but each step felt heavier than the last. He didn't know how he was going to face Sarah, or if he even wanted to, but he knew one thing: nothing would ever be the same again. The next few days passed in a blur for Chris. His mind remained clouded with a mixture of anger, betrayal, and an overwhelming sense of loss. He couldn't bring himself to talk to Sarah. Every time he tried to pick up the phone or start a conversation, the words caught in his throat, like a knot he couldn't untangle. What could he say? What was there to say? The life they had built, the family they had created, all seemed like a cruel illusion now. His thoughts constantly circled back to the image of Sarah and Daniel together, and each time the pain intensified. Every corner of their home felt foreign to him. It was no longer a place of comfort. Instead, it was filled with memories he couldn't bear to revisit. For the first time in years, Chris felt utterly alone. The laughter of his children, the bustle of daily life, all seemed distant, like he was watching it from behind a thick glass window. He found himself avoiding their eyes, unable to smile when they greeted him. They were too young to understand, but he couldn't shake the feeling that they could sense something was wrong. He wanted to hide from them, to escape the reality that had upended his world, but he couldn't. The responsibilities of being a father kept pulling him back, even though every interaction felt like a reminder of what had been lost. Sarah, on the other hand, seemed to be acting like nothing had changed. She was still going about her daily routine, as if she hadn't just shattered the trust between them. She tried to reach out to him, leaving messages asking if he was okay, suggesting they sit down and talk. But Chris couldn't bring himself to respond. Every message felt like a mockery, a reminder that she was pretending everything was normal, while he was drowning in confusion and hurt. He couldn't understand how she could move forward so easily, how she could continue with her life as if nothing had happened. Did she not feel the same weight of betrayal that he did? One evening, after days of silence, Sarah finally confronted him. She sat him down on the couch, her face etched with worry, her hands fidgeting in her lap. She looked at him with wide, pleading eyes, asking him why he hadn't been responding. Chris couldn't look at her. The anger bubbled up in him, mixing with the hurt and confusion, and he felt a surge of emotion so strong it nearly consumed him. He wanted to scream, to demand answers, to understand why this had happened, but instead, all he could manage was a cold, distant stare. Sarah's voice cracked as she apologized, but her words felt hollow to him. She explained how the affair had started innocently enough, how she had been lonely, how Daniel had given her the attention she had been craving, but Chris couldn't bring himself to listen to her explanations. He had already seen the truth, and no words could undo the damage. The more she spoke, the more distant he felt from her. Every word felt like a justification, an excuse for what had happened. He couldn't understand why she had kept this secret from him for so long. They had always talked about everything. The silence that followed her confession was deafening. Chris didn't know what to say. His mind raced with conflicting emotions, but no clarity came. The once solid foundation of their marriage had crumbled, and now there was nothing left but the wreckage of shattered trust. He stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "I need time," was all he managed to say before he turned and walked out of the room. He didn't know where he was going, just that he needed to get away. The world felt like it was closing in on him, the walls of his own home suffocating him. As he walked out the door, he realized he wasn't sure when he'd return, or if he ever would. The life he had known no longer existed, and he didn't know how to rebuild it, or if he even wanted to. The following days felt like a blur of numbness and exhaustion for Chris. Each moment was a battle between his overwhelming feelings of anger and his desperate need for clarity. He spent hours driving aimlessly, trying to outrun the storm inside his mind. But every road he took only led him back to the same crushing reality. His world had been torn apart, and no matter how much he tried to escape, he needed space. He needed to find himself again, to rediscover who he was without the constant ache of betrayal hanging over him. The next morning he sat down with Sarah, his heart heavy with the weight of his decision. The conversation was quiet, somber, but there was no anger in his voice. He didn't shout, didn't accuse her. He simply told her the truth. He couldn't stay in a marriage that had been so profoundly changed. The decision wasn't made out of vengeance or spite, but out of a need to protect himself and find some semblance of peace. Sarah's face crumpled with emotion as the reality of what was happening hit her. She begged him to reconsider, to give their marriage another chance, but Chris knew deep down that he had made the right choice. The trust they had once shared was gone, and while there may have been a glimmer of love between them, it wasn't enough to bridge the chasm that had opened between them. As Chris left the house, he felt a strange mix of relief and sorrow. He was stepping into the unknown, but for the first time in weeks he felt like he was in control of his own life again. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew that he needed to start healing, to rebuild not just his life, but his heart. And though the road ahead would be difficult, he was determined to walk it no matter how long it took.